Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. I'm Boaz. Here with us tonight, returning is Rich Rubino, political historian. And we last spoke with Rich just before and just after the 2024 presidential election. And he had a wealth of context to give us around that. And now we're about a year past that. We've seen the first year of the Trump administration and all kinds of, I would say, political and social and economic shifts. And Rich, so happy to have you back to talk with us about them.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
So what do you think the how do you encapsulate the story of 2025 politically?
Well, it just shows the vicissitudes of national politics. And this is kind of an archetype of what usually happens. The president either gets elected or gets reelected. They tend to overreach. They tend to be too, in a sense, too partisan or too ideological. Consequently, its pendulum kind of swings back. I remember the night that Trump won, conservatives obviously were ecstatic. But what happens now is that some of those on the right obviously are somewhat disillusioned. But the more important story here is that people who are kind of center right moderates or people who voted for for Mr. Trump, there's a lot of buyer's remorse. And that's partly why I think President's job approval is currently in the late 30s. So what you're seeing right now is some Republicans are distancing themselves from President Trump. Some like Don Bacon from Nebraska, who represents one of the three congressional districts that are represented by a Republican, but last time went for Vice President Harris, has announced he's not running for reelection. You have about 21 Republicans are not running for reelection this time. Now, some of that is because simply they're running for other offices. They're trying to move up. Some are just retiring because of age. But you have 18 Democrats too, by the way. But you do have this scenario where I think a lot of Republicans do not want to run on when they know that the Democrats are going to invariably allegate them to being with President Trump, especially if you're in a district that's about maybe 5 or 6 points went for Trump or 5 or 6 points voted against Trump. You just see this scenario, and you've seen this before, by the way, in history, in the 6 year of a presidency. Harry Truman in 1950, for example. Certainly, we saw this more recently with George W. Bush in 2006 when he lost both the House and the Senate. Nancy Pelosi became the first Democratic speaker in 12 years. So I think that's the scenario you're seeing. It bodes very well right now for the Democrats. The question on the Democratic side is kind of what message do they run on? Is it just being anti-Trump, or do they have some sort of a unified message? And I think perhaps what puts them in the best stead with their constituents is if they try to run basically where their constituents are. In other words, if you're running for Nancy Pelosi's seat in San Francisco, you run on a different agenda than if you're running in the seat where Trump won by about 9 points, currently represented by a Democrat in northern Maine. I think they know that. I think Barack Obama has said basically they just need to win and they need to kind of couch the ideological diversions that currently effectuate.
Well, that raises a lot of questions. I guess maybe a good place to start is what do you think are the issues that have become the most important wedges between Trump and his Republican base?
I think, well, one thing you certainly have is the trade issue. Traditionally, Republicans, all the way from when Eisenhower won the Republican nomination in 1952, all the way through Mitt Romney in 2012, were almost unreserved or unfettered, if you will, free traders. Now the Republican Party is less and less of a free trade party. Consequently, some on the right, I think certainly is an aperture there. Although a lot of Republicans have gone over to Trump's way, Republicans like Lindsey Graham, for example, South Carolina, and are now supporters of the tariffs. But I think that you're going to see some Republicans kind of trying to run away from that a little bit. The other thing is Donald Trump's rhetoric. We just had the instance, for example, where he really fustigated about the on Rob Reiner for displaying TDS or Trump derangement syndrome after he was killed by his son. This is something that Republicans were asked, and even some of the most conservative Republicans, like Warren Davison from Ohio, for example, really tried to distance themselves. So I think the rhetoric it's very much part of it is also the affordability. I think that Donald Trump ran on trying to bring things more affordable. I think some Republicans they're hearing from their constituents that it's not affordable. The other thing is there is somewhat of a schism, if you will, when it comes to healthcare. There are some Republicans who I think did not want to get rid of the Obamacare subsidies, and some like Josh Hawley from Missouri, who's very conservative, for example, has expressed some discord at that. That's something that the Obamacare was very unpopular when Mr. Obama signed it back in 2010. Consequently, the Democrats lost 63 seats in the 2010 midterms, the biggest any party's lost since Franklin D. Roosevelt won the Democrats back in 1938. But today it's about 57% support. So the Americans really have turned on that issue. And Obamacare is relatively popular now. So Donald Trump, who ran on trying to do something to try to reform Obamacare or change Obamacare, he's run into the fact that Obamacare is now very popular with the constituents of these politicians.
So, Rich, would it be fair to say I'm kind of getting this image of the body politic like this enormous weeble? Do you remember weebles? they
No,
were they were they were like these things that were very weighted at the bottom, and you could push them, and they would wiggle. They would go back and forth. But it seemed like the farther they go over, the
yeah,
stronger there is a force to pull them back to center. And I feel like especially what we've seen recently since we've spoken is both sides have bifurcated maybe more because I feel like I've heard the calmer minds of both sides try to sort of maybe exert that pulling back to center, and the more vociferous, uh, more intensely emotional sides on both sides kind of trying to push it both ways. So and is that the genius of our system, or is it its downfall?
that's very interesting. I think it is very much a genius because what usually happens is somebody gets elected to office and they think that they have a mandate from the American people, so they propose something that then becomes relatively unpopular, and then the party lands up losing. I mean, it's just for and recent examples of that would be Ronald Reagan came in 1980 and he ran on basically saying that he was going to balance the federal budget and he was going to cut taxes. So he cut taxes the first year, and then the deficit rose. Consequently, in 1982, the Republicans lost 26 seats in the United States House of Representatives. Another example would be Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton came in 1993 on a mandate, partly to raise taxes on those making on the wealthier Americans. There was a backlash against that. He also proposed healthcare reform and put Hillary in charge of it. There was a backlash against that. If you remember the Harry and Louise ads, and as a result, the Democrats lost about 53 seats in the House, most any part, basically the first time in 40 years that the Democrats no longer held the House of Representatives. Barack Obama, 2008, comes in, mandate partly on healthcare, proposes a healthcare legislation. It becomes demonstrably unpopular. The party loses 63 seats. And then George W. Bush, in his first 2 years, he was actually pretty popular because at the time, believe it or not, both Afghanistan and Iraq were very popular. But in his second term, he proposed he's going to try to reform and partially privatize Social Security. There's a backlash against that, and the first time in 12 years, Republicans land up losing seats. Donald Trump, you can keep going, loses 40 seats in after his first midterm election. So this is almost invariably happens that the party in power overreaches, and then when they land up overreaching, there is a revolt, if you will, at the ballot box.
So we can't really blame the public for experiencing vertigo or whiplash or something like that.
No, no, it's I guess it is really kind of, I guess, the genius of the system that a sovereign comes in, the sovereign proposes something, but one thing is there are a lot of checks and balances. But when a party controls all three branches of government and tries to get something through with all three branches of government, there's usually a revolt on the part of those in the center, I think, and it's also somewhat buyer's remorse. People that voted for that person or for that political party, they don't see the benefits right away. Consequently, they start to either go to the other party or they become just completely disconsolate with the system in general. So that's usually what you have.
I'm curious to go back to something you said a little while ago, Rich, about will the Democratic Party come up with a platform other than being anti-Trump? And I wonder if there are any signals about what that platform might consist of if they do.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, I think the best strategy for the Democrats is to run on their district, not to run necessarily on a national platform, because the Democrats, there are currently 13 Democrats in the House of Representatives who represent congressional districts that last time around went for Donald Trump. So for them to win, they're not going to, it's not that the best thing is to try to distance themselves as much as possible from the party, to say that they're independent minded. Of course, the biggest, they could have a problem with having potentially a primary challenge, but in terms of the general election, the best thing is to say that they're independent minded and say we really need to work together. We need to find bipartisan solutions, and then hyper focus really on local type issues, issues that potentially can garner bipartisan support, like trying to bring funding for the district, trying to bring funding for the respective state, that type of a thing. But my guess is that if there is a plan, it would be very, if there is a proposal that, say, Akeem Jeffries and the Democratic High Command come up with, it's going to be something that's going to be very much speaking in platitudes. It's going to talk about bringing affordability and how they're going to try to end the affordability crisis. It's going to talk about certainly health care. It's going to be much in defense of Obamacare, because Obamacare is very popular and it's very popular in the middle of the country right now. So it's going to be something like that. And other than that, it's going to be very much in speaking in platitudes, which is probably the best thing. If you have something in there that's very ideological or very partisan, that's going to end up hurting those 13 Democrats who represent districts that went for Donald Trump last time.
Yeah, and I guess that buys them time to get a national platform together for 28.
Yeah, but it's interesting. In 2028, it's another scenario because you're going to have about 37,000 candidates running for the Democratic nomination. And the Democrats right now have a very big bunch. It's the biggest bench I think I've seen on the part of the Democrats probably since 1991, when you were looking at potential Democrats for president. You had, Al Gore, you had Dick Gephardt, you had Jesse Jackson, you had Joe Biden, you had Lloyd Benson, and then you landed up George W. Bush. H.W. Bush was popular, and he landed up with Bill Clinton, Doug Wilder, Al Gore, Larry Agron, Tom Harkin, and Bob Kerrey, respectively. Right now, you look at it, there are a lot of particularly governors who are outside of the system who are thinking about running. One of them is Andy Beshear from Kentucky, for example, who's been elected 3 times in a state where Donald Trump last time won by 64% of the vote. Now, granted, the first time he was elected attorney general, then governor, that might have been because his father was a very popular governor. But the fact of the matter is, he was reelected. He is in the mode of someone like Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton, who gets elected in more conservative states and knows how to talk to more conservative voters. So that's one possibility. The other ones, I mean, certainly Mark Kelly from Arizona is somebody who was on Vice President Harris's shortlist last time. He's someone that brings military credentials. He's somebody that he comes from a swing state. Congressman Galeo, another senator from Arizona, is someone who potentially is looking at it. I think Gavin Newsom is probably the preponderant front runner right now. Pete Buttigieg is certainly looking at it right now. You can just go. Wes Moore is a possibility, the current governor of Maryland. Vice President Harris might still get back into the race. So you really have you really have a litany of people that are looking at it, and they know this is an open seat. And open seats don't come too often, where there is no incumbent president and no incumbent vice president running, and a lot of these candidates might also be running potentially for another position. They could be trying to get sway with some of the donors if they want to run for an office in their home state, or they might be looking for a cabinet position or something like that. And like you saw with Pete Buttigieg last time, who came out of nowhere as the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, very little name recognition. He became the transportation secretary in the Obama administration. Another one is Doug Burgum on the Republican side, governor of North Dakota, very obscure. He runs for president, doesn't go anywhere, but he becomes on the short list for vice president and consequently becomes part of the Trump administration in the Interior Department.
Yeah,
It sounds like you think JD Vance is not going to run
Oh, on
for
the
president.
Republican side, I absolutely think JD Vance is going to run.
Oh, I thought you said no incumbent president or vice president coming in,
On the
but you meant
Democratic side.
Democrats. Got it. Okay.
no.
On the Democratic side, there'll be no incumbent president or vice president running. On the Republican side, there will be an incumbent, and I really don't envisage a scenario where JD Vance does not run.
I just wanted to add a part two to that question. I mean, that part of the question was kind of about the face of both parties, but we spoke in our first one of our first two conversations about how with the American system we have two parties. A lot of countries have 20 parties or so that these two parties really represent coalitions.
Yes.
And in my lifetime, I feel like when I was young, these coalitions were relatively stable. But now it seems like we're seeing a reshuffling within the coalitions on both sides. Is there a reforming that has to come together, a redefinition, a refeeling of who we are this time around to be able to face 2028, do you think?
This is a really great question because it's absolutely true. The parties, believe it or not, there was a time when the parties were not necessarily ideological. The Democrats, for example, you had traditional liberals, people like Hubert Humphrey, Eugene McCarthy, George McGovern, but then you had conservative segregationists in the same party. George Wallace was once a Democrat. Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas. Richard Russell from Georgia. You had some of the most conservative members of the entire United States Congress were someone like James Eastland, a senator from Mississippi. They wouldn't have anything in common with the current Democratic Party, and they would usually vote sometimes 90% of the time conservative. There was what's called the Conservative Coalition, and it was basically Western Republicans like Barry Goldwater and Southern conservative Democrats. And the Democrats had the liberal wing of the Northeast, in some cases the West, and then they would kind of battle it out internally. On the Republican side, you had conservative Republicans, libertarian Republicans in the West, and then you had, believe it or not, the term which you don't hear too much today, liberal Republicans, proud liberal Republicans, like Senator Ed Brooke from Massachusetts, James Jabbis from New York State, Governor John Volpe from Massachusetts, and they would not be recognized in today's Republican Party. They would very much be Republican, Democrats. So what we have now is the ideological homogenization of the Republican Party, the ideological homogenization of the Democratic Party, and there's very few centrists in both parties. Part of that is because of gerrymandering. Basically, it's gotten to the point now where to get elected in a certain congressional district, you have to basically fend off somebody on the Democratic side from the left, the Republican side from the right. It's a part because the districts are so ideological. But there are a few centrists, and those centrists that there are usually the ones that kind of are the rainmakers, but consummately, they're also the ones that when they run for that actually have contested elections. And there are very few, as I say, there are 13 Democrats who represent districts that went for Trump, only 3 Republicans, believe it or not, only 3 that represent congressional districts that last time voted for Vice President Harris. And of those 3, one of them is not running for reelection. The other 2, Mike Lawler from New York and Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, are very much in marginal districts right now. At least you could have a scenario theoretically where there are no Republicans that represent districts that voted for Harris in the 2026 midterm elections. And I also want to say what's interesting is you see an ideological realignment in terms of the Republican Party, for example, from 1952 with Eisenhower all the way through Mitt Romney, was very much known as the party of free trade. Now the Republican Party is the party of economic nationalism. It's very hard to find a Republican who is not a supporter of terrorists, for example. Some are kind of distancing themselves from them. You have the libertarian wing like Rand Paul, who's always going to be a free trader, but they are distancing themselves a little bit. So you have that certainly. I think in terms of military action overseas, the Democrats certainly in the times of the Iraq War, the Democrats kind of made their name specifically in 2006 in the midterms by being against the Iraq War. Now, on some issues, for example, in the issue of Ukraine, many Democrats are the hawkish party, and the Republicans have been kind of the dovish wing of the more dovish ideological, more dovish ideologically. So it's very interesting how Donald Trump has really kind of transmogrified what it means to be a Republican, and it's very different than what it was under Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Bush Jr., and George H.W. Bush.
I want to talk more about foreign policy, but before we get to that, you touched on trade, and so maybe we should talk about the economy a little more.
Yeah.
We're in this situation where, the market has stabilized somewhat, but at record highs, and unemployment is starting to look like it's as bad as it's been in 20 plus years. You'll know exactly how much with your amazing memory. So we're seeing that split, and that I think is concerning. What do you think is happening in the economy?
I think that we really don't know the long term of the economy. We don't know where the economy is going to be a year from now for the midterm elections. Right now, we have a scenario where there is a lot of trepidation about the economy. Very few Americans, and this is where there's a disconnect between Donald Trump and some of the American people, do not feel good about the economy. They feel that the inflation that really slashed Joe Biden and made Joe Biden in part announce he's not running for reelection. They think that has really, I think, hurt. That's really hurt Donald Trump because they don't not believe that he's done enough to get rid of the inflation. I think there's just a lot of unease generally in terms of the cost of living as everything tends to go up. And it really doesn't, the numbers don't really matter in the aggregate, in the macro numbers. It's the micro numbers that really matter. And it's how people are feeling. And a perfect example of that is George H.W. Bush in 1992, when he was running for reelection. He was trying to talk about how great the economy was. And in part, the numbers were actually increasing. The numbers were actually not that bad, but people didn't perceive it. It didn't really directly affect them at that point. Consequently, George H.W. Bush lost re-election to Bill Clinton that year.
Cool. Thanks, Rich. So maybe let's talk about foreign policy and maybe especially like the hot areas. We've got Russia, Ukraine. We've got the Middle East, and then Iran, I guess, as part of the Middle East. China, Taiwan. What do you see? What's happened this year, and where is it headed?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, on the issue of Ukraine, you have a scenario where the Republican Party as a whole, at least there is a divide. There are still some Republicans who believe that the United States will do all they can to try to fund Ukraine. There are other Republicans that say that this is not our fight. Some believe that the United States should not even be a part of NATO anymore. Some don't even believe they should be part of the United Nations. But this is seen, they believe that this is kind of a voluntary war. It's interesting. Some of them believe that the root causes of of what's happening in terms of Russia wanting to go into Ukraine is that they were afraid that Ukraine was going to join NATO. There's a lot of opposition to NATO expansion. I think it began Bill Clinton in 1997 when they brought in the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. George W. Bush added some more countries as well. So I think that Ukraine is really a war that's more or less favored by Democrats. It's also a war, if you will, that is not really on the front pages as much as it was. It just kind of gone. It's kind of gone. It's gone on for so long that it's not necessarily the hot area. Now you go to the Middle East. It's interesting. I think that on October 7th, 2023, there was almost ecumenical support for Israel after that attack. I think that since then, it is very much dissipated, particularly on both the Republican and the Democratic Party. I think that it's not necessarily that they're opposed to Israel as much as they're opposed to Benjamin Netanyahu and his policies in Gaza. I think on the Democratic side, there's a divide between younger Democrats who believe that the United States needs to do something for there to be either a binational state or a Palestinian state, but they want the war to end and they want the carnage to end in Gaza. And then they're more traditional Democrats. I think someone like Steny Hoyer, um, Nancy Pelosi, Jim Clyburn, the former leadership of the party, who is more in line, not necessarily with Netanyahu, but they're more in line with the United States' current policy of aiding Israel. So that's the divide in the Democratic Party. On the Republican side, you have a schism as well. You have many Republicans who very much, when you say something like, is it time to end the war in Israel, or for that matter, when there wasn't a ceasefire, do we need a ceasefire? They'll immediately say, we blame Hamas, we blame Hamas. But then you have other people on the right wing of the party, Thomas Massey, for example, a libertarian member from Kentucky, who has very much excoriated Israel. Tucker Carlson, who used to be very much a supporter of of the Israeli government when he was on Crossfire, for example, has really done a 360 or 180 rather, and he's really on the other side of this right now. So this is really a divide. And I think on the Democratic Party specifically, there's a lot of issues with AIPAC. And AIPAC is essentially an organization that advocates for the policies of the Israeli government. And they used to have a lot of support in the Democratic Party. Now there's a lot of people in the Democratic Party that say that the Democrats should turn away from AIPAC and that AIPAC is prolonging the war, that they're not advocating for Israel. They're advocating for the Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu. That's a divide in the Democratic Party. And there's another more traditional Democrats who say that the United States need to continue to aid Israel. But I think the mainstream position right now is that they should obviously have a ceasefire and that they should be, and obviously this is somewhat platitudinous, but that they need to work in some form for there to be a two-state solution and that there needs to be some sort of a Palestinian state. Bill Clinton is very interesting in this because when he's confronted with this, he mentions that in 2000, he actually had Yasser Arafat, who was in charge of the Palestinian Authority. There are two basically branches in Israel. There's the Palestinian Authority, and there's those in there's there's basically the government of Fatah on the West Bank who supports a two-state solution, who the United States deals with, and there's Hamas who took over in an election in 2006, who the United States does not deal with except for indirectly through the Qataris, for example, and they currently are hegemonic in Gaza. And what Bill Clinton says is that they tried to have an agreement. He spent 15 days at Camp David with Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak, who was a more moderate or liberal leader of Israel, but they couldn't come up with one. But had they come up with a solution at the time, there would have been a Palestinian state in 2000. And he oftentimes times brings that up when he hears young people talking about the need for a Palestinian state. But I think that in the long term, it's hard to see there being any other solution other than some form, some way that there is both an Israeli state with security and a Palestinian state which has security as well and some form of autonomy. And how you unify the West Bank and Gaza, I don't know. They're obviously in completely different areas. They're not connected, and they have different governments. And there's obviously a lot of disillusionment. And Fatah and and Hamas, they've been fighting too. So there's a lot of tension between that as well, and how you kind of unify those two views and those two views of Palestine and Israel. I don't know how you do that.
Anything to report on China and Taiwan?
Very interesting. I think that is very much an under the radar issue. It's always been an under the radar issue. Going back to when, I think there have been times when it was very much in the news, 1950s, for example, when when the communist Chinese took over, when Mao Zedong and his communist Chinese coefficients took over mainland China. That was something that was very much an issue that went against Harry Truman. The Republicans in '52 talked about Korea because Korea War kept going for communism because communism would take over in China, and corruption because there was corruption in the Truman administration. There were other times when certainly China and Taiwan had become issues. Jimmy Carter, for example, in 1979, recognized mainland China as the actual Chinese government, not what's going on not the Taiwanese government. But it's a very interesting scenario because there's always a possibility that the United States gets too embedded in other issues and what's going on in the Ukraine and what's going on in Gaza, in our own domestic issues, that somehow China somehow takes over Taiwan. And if that does happen, what is the United States' response? And Joe Biden got in a lot of trouble because he basically said when he was president, and it surprised a lot of people on the left, that he would actually take military action to defend Taiwan from China. I think it's a war that the United States will get very little out of if they're defending Taiwan against a country that has the largest population in the entire world. And I think that they'll do everything they possibly can simply to keep it at bay. But obviously, they are very much an ally of Taiwan, even though they recognize mainland China as the real government of China.
Uh, I don't know if you saw Zelensky tweeted something today about having information that Russia was planning to prolong the war,
Yeah.
and that he had seen some military activity that supported that thesis. What does an end to that war look like, do you think? And what does Putin really want?
Well, Ukrainians have basically have really suffered a lot to try to get what they want. And what I think one of their main objectives is, and this I think is a non-starter, but one of their original main objectives was to become part of NATO. If they're part of NATO, that means that if there's an invasion by Russia on Ukraine, then under Article 5, every single member of NATO has to come to their defense. And that would be something that would really protect them. That's something that Vladimir Putin and Russia really put their foot down. They do not believe that any more countries should become a part of NATO. That's why they were very much opposed. For example, if you remember, there was a debate back in 1997 for whether to allow Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary into NATO. And Bill Clinton was president at the time. He actually got the support of Jesse Helms, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. They worked together and they got this through. Others, like Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey, were admonishing at the time that if we do this, we're effectuating tensions with Russia, that Russia views this basically basically the equivalent of if they tried to form an alliance with, say, Mexico or Canada or something that was in our backyard. So they view that as very similar. But I think that very few people would have said when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Ukraine would still be standing today. And I think it's kind of embarrassing, if you will, for Russia that they have not been able to win this war over a country that is a lot, certainly less population and size. It's kind of similar, I guess, to the United States not being able to win in Vietnam, to Russia not being able to win in Afghanistan, to the United States not being able to win in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have countries that you have a lot smaller countries that really have the will to try to have some sort of a victory here. What an actual victory on the part of the Ukraine looks like, I don't know. I think for Russia, I think that victory would be something that says that Ukraine, under no circumstances, will be a part of NATO. Theoretically, could they have come up with a deal where there are security guarantees, where NATO guarantees the security of the Ukraine without directly letting them come into NATO and then somehow sign something saying that no new countries will come into NATO? That's, I think, what a victory probably looks like.
I don't know if you saw the strategy document that the White House published about a week ago. I think it was put out by the National Intelligence, or actually, I'm not sure who wrote it, but it seemed to indicate that the United States was shifting its focus from Europe to the
Yep.
Americas, and obviously we've got skirmishes in Venezuela, maybe just with bad actors from the drug trade. We're not sure, right?
Yeah.
What do you think the agenda is with Venezuela, and what does strategy relative to the rest of Latin America look like?
Well, that's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of Jimmy Carter when he ran for president in 1976. He said they're going to be focusing on North South relations more so than East West relations, and basically said that there needs to be kind of a timeout of the Cold War, and he would continue a lot of the détente policies of President Nixon and Ford that changed when Russia invaded Afghanistan. When he took a lot, when he announced the Carter Doctrine, which took a lot more of a conservative or almost bellicose or somewhat neocon agenda. But that's what he basically ran on. Now, in terms of Donald Trump and in terms of relations with Venezuela, this is very interesting because Donald Trump, one of his keystone issues was the United States would not get involved in wars. They would not entangle alliances. Now, there is very little appetite after Afghanistan, after Iraq. What happened in both of them is a very much a war weary, if you will, attitude in the United States. And the United States, it's upwards of 70% of the country do not want a war with Venezuela. If there is to be a war with Venezuela, you would think that under the War Powers Act, within 48 hours, he has to go to Congress and he would have to get, if not a formal declaration of war, at least congressional authorization. And it's very hard for me to envisage a scenario where he gets that in Venezuela. Again, this goes against what he ran on when he ran for office. There's very little appetite in the Republican or the Democratic Party for this. He will make it out to be a domestic issue. It's kind of like an intermestic almost, and say that by taking out these boats, we're saving lives. He's saying we're saving lives because that fentanyl is not getting to the United States. Whether or not he is able to communicate that message, I don't know. Does he have an appetite for any sort of a war? It's very hard for me to see that he wants to spend that he wants to spend his second term potentially fighting Venezuela. This really kind of came out of nowhere, if you will. And I think that many question how much drugs are actually coming from Venezuela versus coming from China versus coming from Mexico versus coming from other countries. But I really don't see there being military action beyond taking out some of the boats.
Yeah, well, I guess he just announced embargo on
Argo.
incoming oil to Venezuela. I don't know if that's an issue for Venezuela if they have enough refinery capacity. I know they have enough oil
Right.
capacity, so I don't see how whether that affects them or not. I don't know. But it's interesting, and certainly we know the cartels in Mexico are extremely powerful, and yeah, I'm also a little mystified by the focus on Venezuela, except for their relationship in BRICS, right? They're part of that kind of alternative to NATO organization.
It reminds me a little bit, actually, of if you remember in Bill Clinton's first term, there were issues of both Cuban refugees and Haitian refugees coming to the United States. And eventually, Clinton's focus went from Cuba to Haiti, and a lot of people question why there was such a focus on Haiti. And eventually, they said that the leader of Haiti, who had taken over from the democratically elected John Bertrand Aristide, this was Rael Cedras, has to be taken out, and they made actually sent Jimmy Carter, Colin Powell, and Sam Nunn to Haiti to say that if you don't leave right now, we're gonna come in militarily. And at the last minute, he did leave, and the military 20,000 troops came in, and but they did not have to actually invade. But this is very similar because I think very few people thought that Haiti was that much the flagship part of the U.S. foreign policy, but it really became a major issue in Bill Clinton's first few years in office.
Right. Yeah, I think it's fair to contextualize that this is not a new north-south sort of sticking point. I was in Peru back under Fujimori when he was the
Oh,
president, and there was a huge battle, and usually the U.S. works through the governments rather than sort of extra governmental, like seems to be happening in Venezuela. But America's always kind of been looking over and supporting the efforts I guess we'd call them police actions is usually the polite term for these kind of interventions.
I think
yeah,
this
that's
is
interesting.
technically anti-terrorist, right? Because I think it was in 2006, drug cartels were classified as terrorist organizations.
I was Yeah, I was just gonna say it's interesting you brought the word up, police action, because it used the Constitution is very explicit. Congress shall declare war. So how is it that basically beginning in Korea, President Truman had what was called a police action, meaning it wasn't a war. And then President Kennedy continued that in Vietnam. President Johnson, President Nixon continued as well. The Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. They have not had a declaration of war, a formal declaration of war. They're a police action, meaning the Congress authorizes it and basically gives plenary authority to the president and his powers in Article 2 powers of being a commander in chief to execute that.
And this sure
I
has
thought
that police actiony flavor, the
Oh, yeah, there's
language
no
around
way
it.
that Trump will actually go to declare war. But that being said, the War Powers Act, this passed over Nixon's veto in 1973, does state that the president does, if it's over after 48 hours, need to go to Congress and get a formal authorization, which essentially is a blank check to execute the war. But he can't do this with plenary. He doesn't have plenary authority without that authorization.
um, my you know this stuff a lot better than I do, Rich. I thought that after 9/11, part of the new security laws that were enacted included kind of an open-ended war on terror, and that
Yes,
opened the door for drug activity to kind of be lumped in with that. And then I
true.
thought there was a declaration of war um, for for going into Iraq. I thought that's what the whole hubbub was about with Colin Powell selling it. I
No,
thought they got it. They didn't?
No, Colin Powell went before the United Nations, not before the Congress. But what happened was there was a use of authorization of military force, and this was back in the first one was actually right after the 9/11 hijackings. George W. Bush went to Congress. He didn't get a formal declaration of war, but he got a congressional authorization, and it actually passed unanimously in the Senate.
To
And in
go
the
into
House, only
Afghanistan. Yeah.
Barbara Lee of Oakland, California, voted against it. She's now the mayor. Into the next year, in 2002, there was a debate about whether to give President George W. Bush the authorization to go into Iraq. Not the they never declared war. There was never a vote to declare war, and that passed basically with most Republicans voting for it in both the House and the Senate. And the Democratic Party was pretty much split on it in the House and the Senate. And interestingly, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, John Edwards, Dick Gephardt, the folks who were going to be running for Joe Biden, who were going to be running for president in the near future, voted for the use of authorization. Whereas I think it was mostly the liberal members of the party and some of the some of the libertarian Republicans who voted against it. But no, they never actually got a formal declaration of war, which Article One basically requires.
Are there any hotspots globally that aren't really on the public's radar yet that we should be keeping an eye on?
I would say South Sudan. South Sudan, what's going on in South Sudan, it's really been under the radar. I think what's going on in the Ukraine, what's going on in Gaza has basically taken up most of the coverage, but certainly what's going on there is certainly an issue. I think there's always issues in South and in Southern and
Rich,
Central
tell
America.
our listeners what's happening in South Sudan.
It's very, very complicated. But basically, there are. I think I'd be better if you just better than me explaining it, just to kind of look it up. I think.
And you were going to say something about elsewhere in Latin America?
I was just saying, generally speaking, in Southern and Latin America, there's always issues certainly going on. But I think that the main hotspots are certainly Russia and Ukraine. I think what's going on, certainly in Gaza, is always a hotspot. I think Iran. I think certainly the fact that Donald Trump, um, I think I think to the chagrin of some of his supporters, favored going in and doing a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. That became very much a sticking point, very much a divide, if you will, within the conservative movement. But I think that that certainly is an issue of in terms of whether Iran is potentially building a nuclear weapon. The Iranians deny it. The United States and most of the world believes that they are building a nuclear weapon. The United States, when it basically favored going in and trying to eliminate their ability to do that. But I think that certainly Donald Trump, you go to Donald Trump generally, he's somebody who's antagonistic toward wars. And there were some people on the left wing, for example, when he first ran in 2016, about 12% of Bernie Sanders supporters voted for Donald Trump. If those people had gone to Hillary Clinton would have been president of the United States. And part of the reason they voted for Donald Trump is they believed that Donald Trump was the anti-war candidate. They believed that he was the person who was going to retrench from foreign entanglements and focus on the United States. Now you have a scenario where some people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, are kind of disillusioned with Donald Trump because she says that Donald Trump should basically park Air Force One in Washington and should not be spending as much time as he is trying to focus on the world's issue and instead should try to focus on the economic well-being of the American people. And I think that's part of America First. America First, it really goes back. And actually, that term goes back to Woodrow Wilson, believe it or not. In 1916, he was a Democrat. World War I had broken out, and he said America's going to stay home and basically America First. Then a couple years later, lands up getting involved in World War I. But he made that term up, and then Warren G. Harding had to use the term America First. Pat Buchanan in 1992, 96 talked a lot about America First, basically saying that the United States needs to retrench from policies abroad and need to focus on domestic issues and almost solely on domestic issues. Again, this is just a divide in the conservative movement.
Yeah. And it's been a threat going back all the way, I think, of protectionism.
Yeah, and I think they would not call themselves protectionists. They would call themselves economic nationalists. I think that protectionists, I think that it's kind of like there's a divide. It's basically they would say that we trade with other countries, but it's fair trade, it's reciprocal trade, and no country and the United States needs to somehow either benefit or be equal from the trade. That's where part of the opposition from NAFTA is that many believe that the jobs would be going overseas. Ross Perot, remember, talked about that big sucking sound, and the jobs would be going down to Mexico. But it's not that they're necessarily against trade. It reminds me a little bit of when people use the term isolationism. A true
Isolation.
isolationist would say that there's no relationship with any other country. We don't exchange ambassadors. We don't trade with other countries. What there are very few people would take that belief, and I don't think there's any country in the world that's truly isolationist. What there are is non-interventionist, meaning essentially that you do not intervene in the policies of other countries and that you trade, you exchange ambassadors, you negotiate deals, but you don't get involved in military alliances. So that's kind of the delineation, I think.
So you just mentioned some fractures in the Republican Party. This might be getting a little more into social topics, but you mentioned Tucker earlier.
Yeah.
One of the big events of 2025 was the assassination of Charlie Kirk.
Yep.
I'm curious, what, how do you see the Republican Party's priorities evolving? Or to Brian's earlier question about the Republican Party actually being a aggregate of a bunch of different perspectives, and we're talking about those splintering apart some. Tucker is doing a very different thing, as you said, than he was doing only a few years ago. Talk a little bit about what Charlie Kirk's assassination did and what's happening in the Republican Party since.
Yes, and Charlie Kirk was somebody he was somebody that I think that older Americans probably did never really heard of because he was more in terms of somebody who was really appealed to young people. He was someone who would go to college campuses and he would basically debate students. He would go to some of the more liberal colleges in the country. So when he was assassinated, I think a lot of people, over 65 and older, said, "Who's Charlie Kirk?" I think people under 35 immediately knew who Charlie Kirk was. He's someone who comes up on social media feeds, and I think that he really became the public face of the younger version of conservatism. And he was really a tribune of Donald Trump's agenda. He was very much a tribune of the America First agenda. He's someone who, for example, opposed the wars in Iraq and opposed the wars in Afghanistan, which is more in line with Donald Trump and some of the more traditional Republicans of that time period. I think when he was assassinated, I think that conservatives kind of came together in many respects and mourned him. And the question he was, by the way, he had a radio show on Real America News that still exists without him, but it was not so much his radio show that he was known for. It was for going out and it was really for debating people. And I think as a result, there were a lot of people who are not interested in politics who really became interested in politics because of him. And he was somebody who was a very effective debater, by the way, very efficacious. He had the facts at his command, and he was really, really good at debating no matter what issue he would be able to kind of the problem, I think, was that sometimes the people that he debated were not well informed, and sometimes the questions were very much obvious, and they would go right to his talking points. I always would watch it, and I'd wait for somebody to ask a creative question or come from left field with something, and they almost never did. It was almost the exact same questions over and over, so he knew how to answer, and he really went after it. Tucker Carlson is very interesting because he's somebody who was once a traditional Republican. When he was actually announced to be the host of Crossfire, Robert Novak, who was going to be the co-host, they basically would go back and forth between two conservatives, said he didn't think Tucker Carlson was conservative enough. And when he was on Crossfire, he was a traditional libertarian type Republican, type of a conservative. He would go on, he would debate the liberal, usually Paul Begala or James Carville, but there was really nothing that was astray from conservatism that he basically represented. I think that in 2008, he actually spoke at Ron Paul's convention, the Counter Republican Convention, which was more or less for non-interventionism on foreign policy. And he tried to move a little bit more toward a more classical conservatism, that of Pat Buchanan, for example, and less of, say, Lindsey Graham or George W. Bush or Dick Cheney. And he really tended to move that way. But he also, like Pat Buchanan, on domestic issues, he was not a traditional libertarian Republican. He's not somebody that says we need to eradicate the social safety net. He's not somebody that even said necessarily that we need universal tax cuts. He became somebody who became populist, socially very conservative, but believed that that the new people who are coming into conservative movement need government help. They're not people who are traditionally the patrician class. You think of as a traditional Republican who hangs out at yacht clubs and golf clubs. He would say these are more people that hang out at somewhere like Sam's Club. So he really, I think, changed his views in terms of domestic issues on foreign policy. Like Donald Trump, he was very much somebody who's favored America First policies. He was very much became a vociferous opponent of the past actions in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And more recently, I think when it comes to Israel, he's become very much somebody who's a critic of the Netanyahu government. Netanyahu is generally pretty popular in the conservative movement. Most conservatives, traditional contemporaneous conservatives, stand with Benjamin Netanyahu. Tucker Carlson has basically very much criticized the Netanyahu government, their actions in Gaza. He's called it a genocide. He's actually visited refugee camps with refugee camps enveloped by Palestinians. This is very much different. I think the other thing that he did, then that's part of where represents a different view of conservatism. There was a young conservative named Nick Fuentes, who's only 27 years old, and he is somebody who very few older conservatives had ever heard of. And Tucker Carlson said he never heard of this guy. He's 27 years old. Most of his appeal is basically people that are in their young 20s, and he's got over 4 million viewers. And one day he went off and he really went off on Tucker Carlson's father after Tucker Carlson's father had died. And Tucker Carlson got enraged about him. And finally someone said, why don't you bring him on our show? So he brought him on the show. And Nick Fuentes, who is very much an extremist. He's somebody who was on Piers Morgan and does not believe women should have the right to vote. He said blacks, for the most part, should be in jail. He was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he sounded very moderate on that Tucker Carlson interview. You listened to him and you said, this is a traditional kind of a conservative. This isn't the Nick Fuentes that you hear, that you watch when he's on his podcast, that really excoriates, has used the N-word, for example. He's really very much an extremist, but there's a criticism with Tucker Carlson is that he mainstreamed him. So now a lot of people know who he is. And then Piers Morgan had him on for 2 hours. And that was the interview where where Piers Morgan asked him questions like, do you believe women should have the right to vote? And he says no. And this is somebody in 2020, this is someone in 2025 who's making that statement. He's somebody who is very much he's somebody who very much questions the Holocaust, for example. So he's now kind of the mainstream, and he's become mainstream, and that's one of the criticisms of Tucker Carlson. But I think generally Tucker Carlson just has a more traditional view of conservatism, and he's really changed his views from where he was during the Crossfire days.
I was about to ask you about Nick Fuentes, so I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought him up. Do you think there's real political power in the part of the conservative movement, if you can call it that, that Nick Fuentes represents?
Yes,
So
he does. Yes, absolutely. He has
how's that going to show up maybe in the midterms or or in 28?
Well, theoretically, he could bring people to the polls, but
Really?
that would have to be not in the general election, more in the primaries, if there's somebody who is at least somewhat ideologically aligned. Now, that being said, almost no Republican will try to tether themselves to Nick Fuentes because of what Nick Fuentes has said. But he does have the potential to bring people out to potentially the most conservative candidate. Now, that being said, most conservatives have disassociated or distanced themselves from him. He does not have much support in the actual Republican Party. He did meet with Donald Trump at one point, and that kind of brought his name out there. But he is somebody who's only 27 years old, and he does have a following. And that following, you wonder how much they actually believe of kind of what he says. But when he was on Tucker Carlson, there's a more moderate version of him. So if he can use the kind of more moderate version of Nick Fuentes to try to get people to listen to him, try to potentially get the vote out, that could be very perilous for more establishment, more moderate type Republicans. But again, I don't know of any member of Congress, of any even conservative member of Congress, who have agreed with what he said about Jews, what he said about blacks, what he said about women. When you listen to him, you almost wonder how much of it is performative, how much of that is something he actually believes versus something that he's just saying to try to essentially make a name for himself, and he has made a name for himself.
Yeah, I mean, I have a part B to that question, and that is that the recurring theme here that I was thinking about before is, we saw the passing of Dick Cheney. We've seen Feinstein leave. We've heard Pelosi say she's going to leave. It's almost like there's a passing of the guard. We're seeing these young people like Vance. We're seeing Mamdani in New York. We're really seeing a generation passing on to a new generation. It feels like with an increased extremism on both sides. And it does make me feel like maybe not performative as much as click driven.
Yeah.
like I heard somewhere that said that a goldfish has a slightly longer attention span than a human does. I'm not making that up. I swear I heard that somewhere. But that means that there's, this idea of hooking, and this has got, similarity to the goldfish, right? We want to hook that attention. And I'm wondering if we're seeing that on both sides with the next chapter, the next generation being modified by the technology of communication that we're in the midst of.
Yes, but I would be careful on one thing. The young vote, and this is, we see sometimes candidates will run against other candidates and they'll make age a big issue. They say it's time for a new generation of leadership. I think that if you look at it, 18 to 25-year-olds, the fact that somebody is in their age group is important, but it's not paramount. It's not the flagship issue for their voting. And the perfect example of this is the 2020 presidential election. 18 to 25-year-olds were the worst demographic for Pete Buttigieg. 18 to 35-year-olds, rather, Pete Buttigieg, the youngest candidate that year, his worst demographic was his own age group, or those a little bit younger than him. Bernie Sanders' best demographic was the youngest demographic. Now, Bernie Sanders is 83 years old right now, and Pete Buttigieg is about 43 years old. So they weren't necessarily voting I don't think they just look and say, I want somebody that looks like me. They say somebody who has somebody that I want that has my ideas. We're seeing this. It's going to be a very interesting scenario in places like Massachusetts, for example. Ed Markey, who's really been a champion of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, he has a challenge currently with Seth Moulton, who's a little bit more a little bit more centrist in the Democratic Party. Moulton has really made the issue that it's time for a generational change, and you wonder how much Ed Markey. I mean, he certainly is in line with younger voters ideologically, but you wonder if Seth Moulton can really make age more of, and not so much age per se, but make the idea that you need somebody from a new generation much of an issue. I remember Eric Swalwell, who's currently a congressman from California, who's running for governor of California. He ran for president last time, and he kept talking about how we need a new generation of leadership. The Democratic Party never really accepted him as being their tribune. So I would just be cautious to say that age is an issue and people do want somebody potentially who's younger. But if somebody's more ideologically aligned, and another example of that, I guess, would be Ed Markey last time when he ran for Senate in 2020, Joe Kennedy. One of the Kennedys ran against him, and one of his issues was it's time for new leadership. And a lot of the younger people got behind Ed Markey because Ed Markey has really been more ideologically in line with them than Kennedy. So it's not the sole issue.
So you think we'll see more 80-year-old presidential candidates?
No,
I want
not in the
a
future.
hard prediction here.
No, I think no. Chuck Grassley and Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi will not run for president of the United States. Is my prediction. Maybe there'll be a joint ticket. Maybe Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell will come together and form a third party and run in 2028. And I'm sure
You
the
heard
young
it
people.
here first.
No, I think that that is true. There are a lot of older members of the Democratic and Republican establishment that are not seeking reelection. Mitch McConnell is one. Nancy Pelosi is part of the reason I think for Nancy Pelosi is there was both AOC's chief of staff, former chief of staff, was running against her, and she would have made, and there was a state senator as well that was running, and they would have really made this a big campaign issue. They would have made the fact that not that she's older, but that they're further to the left than her, and that she's too centrist. And that was I don't think she wanted to spend her last years campaigning in something where potentially she could actually could be very much a contested election in San Francisco. So that's part of the reason I think she's not announcing. There are some. Bernie Sanders, I think, probably has basically said that he will probably not seek another term when this term is up. But he's got a lot of energy. I mean, for somebody 83 years old, he goes all around the country with AOC. He has a lot of energy. So I think because of that, I think that's why young people kind of cling when they see the energy that potentially they have. But Chuck Grassley he's 91 years old, and he visits all 99 counties of Iowa every single year and looks very good. Ed Markey's 80 years old. Ed Markey's making videos. Ed Markey looks very good right now. Chuck Schumer is an interesting one. because I think certainly physically he looks good, but I think many in the Democratic Party do believe that they need to change him regard, not necessarily because of his age, but because they believe that he worked too much, that he's too centrist, and they were very disconsolate that he worked with President Trump last time around in March and supported ending the government shutdown. So consequently, there's a movement that if AOC does not seek re-election in 2028, does not run for president in 2028, and Chuck Schumer is to run for re-election, I think he'd have a lot of problem with AOC challenging her. But my guess
And
is that
that
Schumer
hamburger
probably
thing hurt him a lot too, I think.
what?
The cheeseburger thing. Do you remember that?
No.
He was being, it was kind of like Elizabeth Warren's "let's just have a beer" moment when he was out back and he was barbecuing, but he's got a raw hamburger patty there, and he puts the cheese right on. It's not cooked at all yet, and just everybody who's ever barbecued a cheeseburger ever in their life was a total tip off. It was like Tim Waltz trying to shoot a shotgun. It was like,
Oh,
no, where are the aides here? You get paid well for this. You couldn't see this coming. Come on.
I remember John Kerry when he was trying to show off his prowess on guns. He walked into a gun shop and he says, "Is this where I can get me a hunting license?" And
Yeah,
then I remember Mitt Romney was in Detroit, and a bunch of people came up to him, and what they were saying, what they take the picture. He started singing the rap song, "Who Let the Dogs Out?" He says, "Who let the dogs out? Who?" Just like that, and you can see that on YouTube. And it's Mitt Romney trying to be one of the people, and it's very hard when you come from that background to even if you. I mean, Chuck Schumer didn't come from an extremely wealthy background, but when you've been in politics as long as he has, it's very hard when you're running for when you're in office to still try to come off as the regular person, which is what the genius of George W. Bush is, that he's somebody who went to Phillips Academy, the best prep school in the country, arguably, went to Yale, Harvard Business School, yet he was able to become governor of Texas, and people really thought of him as this kind of guy who clears brush on his
there's
ranch.
brush. Yep.
A
Yeah,
Following
genius.
watch
Ronald
this
Reagan,
drive.
right?
Yes, and Lyndon Johnson, who actually did come from that background.
Exactly.
So, Rich, another big thing, you were just talking about youth and also some of the dynamics in the Democratic Party. Another big thing that happened in 2025 was the election of Mamdani as mayor of New York. Talk about that a little bit.
Yes, this was really a fascinating thing. When he first announced his candidacy, he was very much a fringe candidate. He was a member of the state legislature, so he had been elected to office, and he was at about 1% in the polls. And there was a litany of more establishment Democrats that were running. Brad Linder was one. Andrew Cuomo was the early front runner, a former governor of New York who had to kind of resign in disgrace, if you remember, over sexual harassment charges. And he really ran, and he really did a lot in terms of social media specifically. He really ran on a social media platform, and he spent a lot of time on social media, sometimes new forms of social media. And he ran as the most liberal candidate, and he was an avowed democratic socialist. 20 years ago, nobody would be elected any office if they called themselves a socialist. Bernie Sanders changed that. When Bernie Sanders ran for, well, when he became mayor of Burlington, but then he became United States senator. So he was a senator from Vermont, and he was kind of a backbencher. But then when he ran for president in 2016, a lot of people came to his cause as a democratic socialist, challenging the more establishment center left Hillary Clinton. And there's really been a movement of democratic socialists across the country. They've been elected to many offices. There was one that actually almost got elected mayor of Buffalo a few years earlier. But he basically ran, and he ran on a coalition. The coalition, partly because he's Muslim, a lot of Muslims came on and supported him. Interestingly, Muslims generally tend to be very conservative. Socially, specifically, they're very conservative. Mamdani is very much the opposite. He's very much a social liberal. And that's where but I think that there was a lot of Muslims that came on and voted for him. A lot of young people came on and voted for him because they were really sick and tired of the establishment. I think there was a movement. A lot of female voters were kind of disgusted by the fact that Andrew Cuomo, what he had done as governor. He was very popular, by the way, his first few years as governor, and actually been elected He'd been elected. He'd certainly had been elected governor. He'd been elected in first in 2010, 2014, 2016. He probably, had it not been for some of the scandals, one of them involving nursing home patients, the other involving sexual harassment, he could have run again in 2020. He's somebody who, 2022 rather, he's somebody who potentially was thought of as a presidential candidate in 2020 before the scandal erupted. A lot of people thought that he potentially should run for president and they should take Joe Biden off the ticket. But I think that Mamdani is really much the future, I think, in terms of a very specific urban Democrat constituency. Could he get elected in Idaho? No way. Could he get elected in a more middle of the road state? No way. So you wonder where his kind of political ceiling is. But certainly getting elected in the biggest city in the country, but also a very democratic city and a very liberal city, Staten Island excluded, of course, is it does show that certainly the Democratic Party is moving to the left, and the question is going to be, now that he's been elected, will he moderate some of his stances? And a lot of what he has to get through, he can't just get through, just have the city council sign, he signs it. A lot of that has to go through the legislature and Governor Kathy Hochul. And the question is going to be how much of what he does is going to be accepted. And my prediction, I think he's going to be a lot like what Bernie was when he was mayor of Burlington. Bernie ran as a democratic socialist, and a lot of people thought he was just going to come in, he was going to be extremist, he was going to be all rhetoric. When he actually came in, his main accomplishments was bringing in a baseball team to Burlington, Vermont, and he worked to cut property taxes. So as a practical matter, there's always, you talk about the rhetoric is very much going to be democratic socialist, but he's going to get into office and he's going to look around and say, do I want there to be a legacy? Do I want something to actually get through? And in order to do that, he's going to have to compromise. And a lot of his core supporters on the left, I think, are probably going to be a little bit animus toward him because they believe he's going to come in, he's going to just shake up the whole system. But I think he's going to be a little bit more establishment oriented. I could be wrong, but that's my guess.
Do you think he's going to make the maths math?
The what?
Is the math going to math the way with his policies for New York City?
That's a good question. That's a good question. And that's something that Andrew Cuomo really used against him. And he was very vague, talks in platitudes in many respects, like a lot of people do in politics. But he's very good at that. He's very good at talking in platitudes. And now the question you're right, now that you're saying about the math, bringing in free transit, for example, how is he going to do that? Bringing about government-owned grocery stores. They have been done in parts of the United States, but never in a large place like New York City. And again, I think that he's going to have to, you can try to get 100% of the loaf and not settle for anything unless you get 100% of the loaf, or you can try to get 60 or 70% of it. And that's my guess on what he's going to get. It's a lot different running for office. Running for office, you can promise you're going to have government-run grocery stores, you're going to end the affordability crisis. But once you actually get in there and you actually look at the statistics, it's a very austere challenge to actually get that done. So I think that my guess is his base is going to be a little bit, there's going to be a little displeasure on the part of his base that he's not just going to be involved, that it's just not just going to be rhetoric oriented, but he's actually going to be trying to get something accomplished.
So I just had one more Mamdani question. It's kind of trivial, but it might point to something, and that is, it seems like most of my life it's always been conventional wisdom that if you want to run for public office, don't have a beard. Since Abraham Lincoln, I think.
Benjamin Harrison.
Say it again.
Benjamin Harrison, 1888, got elected with a beard, the last president to have a beard in office. Bill Clinton had a beard at one point. When he was younger, Bill Clinton had a beard. But
is something changing in the body politic as far as what makes sense? Is this part of that generational thing?
Yes, I do. I think there's going to be a revolution in the body politic. And I think that those with beards, if you look at it, go back to the days of Aristotle, Socrates, they very much were beard oriented. And after you mentioned Abraham Lincoln had a beard and no mustache, which is very interesting. Then after him came Andrew Johnson, no beard. Then came Ulysses S. Grant with a beard and a mustache. Then Rutherford B. Hayes with a beard and a mustache. Then James Garfield in 1880 with a beard and a mustache, succeeded by Chester A. Arthur, who had a mustache and had kind of mutton chops. Right. And then Grover Cleveland had a mustache but no beard. And then Benjamin Harrison kind of ended it by being a president with a beard. But Theodore Roosevelt had a beard in the younger years of his life. And if you look at pictures of Bill Clinton when he was about 25 years old, he too had a beard. But I don't think that his long kind of hippie beard is something that would really could get him elected as attorney general or governor of Arkansas. So we had to cut it.
So what I hear you saying is that Vermin and I have a chance.
I met him actually. I met him. You know what? The guy he's talking about, Vermin Supreme, was this big beard. He runs for president every year. And I saw him in New Hampshire on election day, on the day of the primary. And what he does, he waits for, there's a hotel where all the candidates go, basically on election day. A lot of them have their headquarters there. And they're walking in and they're doing last minute interviews. Some of the stations rent rooms there, not like hotel rooms, but some of the rooms on the first floor. And what he does is he waits for the candidates to come out of rooms, and he goes on. And he starts bothering them and asking him random questions, and really questions like who's your favorite Rolling Stone, that type of thing. And at one point, Marjorie Taylor Greene, he stood out for about 45 minutes while she was being interviewed for someone. Then Marjorie Taylor Greene walks out, and then he's just there trying to annoy her, and he's going like this in the background. He's a guy that wears a boot in his head, and you do look a little bit alike.
Right, and not just any boot, the boot of freedom.
Yes.
In fairness.
And he runs every time, and he gets in the ballot. Running for president of New Hampshire is very easy, by the way. All you really need is $1,000 filing fee, and you're pretty much on the ballot as a Democrat or a Republican. So it's really not as hard as you would think it would. Now, that being said, it's harder to get on other states' ballots, but New Hampshire is very liberal in terms of getting on the ballot for a primary.
You mentioned that state-owned grocery stores had been tried elsewhere in the U.S. I'm not familiar with that. Do you know more about it?
There have been a couple random ones, but it's not really been a major thing. It's kind of like there's a state-owned bank, I think, in North Dakota that still exists, but it's the only one that's there. So there's not really much of a sample size that would matter.
Gotcha.
And you run the risk, I would think, of driving the local, real businesses out of business. And then when you go bankrupt because your math didn't math, now you've really created a food desert.
Yeah, and he says that he's going to only do them in the food deserts where there are no other grocery stores. But obviously, if somebody who owns a grocery store in New York City, it's something you've got to be very skeptical of the fact that the government would have it, and potentially people would be spending a lot less money going into the government grocery store. It's going to be a very interesting experiment if it actually even effectuates, and maybe it won't.
Right. While your taxes go up.
Right. That's another issue. Again, you can promise the world when you run for office. Once you actually get elected to office, it's a lot different. Once you actually look at the statistics, for example, Bill Clinton, when he ran in 1992, he talked about a middle-class tax cut. He was saying, I want a middle-class tax cut on a middle-class tax cut. One of his opponents that year, Paul Tsongas, said that we can't have a middle-class tax cut. He used to say, I'm no Santa Claus. And his proposal was basically to cut governments was that they need to somehow truncate government spending, and that they need to raise the gas taxes. Bill Clinton comes into office in 1993. He looks at the budget picture. The deficit's what he was inherited is a lot bigger than he expected, and he can't do the middle class tax cut. And he has to announce he's not going to do the middle class tax cut. Instead, he's going to focus on deficit reduction. And in 1993, his Budget Discretionary Act, the first budget, which is credited with helping to stimulate the economy in the 90s, was predicated on deficit reduction and increased taxes, very similar to what Paul Tsongas had run on. So, when you hear the rhetoric, sometimes somebody can do it, and there's an easy way to do it, but generally speaking, the rhetoric is a lot different than the reality.
That's a good segue. I was going to ask you what you think about the extent to which the federal deficit has grown. Has Trump done anything with trade policy that might be reducing the deficit, and how serious of a problem do we have?
We definitely do. The national debt is over $30 trillion. And it would be a lot bigger. Actually, President Johnson, back in 1967, in order to pay for both the Great Society, a social program in Vietnam, they basically amalgamated the Social Security trust fund with the general fund, and it makes the actual national debt is a lot bigger than if you were to calculate with pre-1967 numbers. But that being said, it is over $30 trillion, and the deficit is the yearly amount that's added to the debt. and that continues to increase. Donald Trump believes, I think, that the tariff will decrease. That the tariff that we're going to bring in a lot of money that we did not have before that, and he says that he's going to use some of that to try to decrease the deficit. But he also says he wants to give $2,000 to the American people in terms of a tariff dividend. And if you're giving somebody a tariff dividend, obviously that's not money that's going toward paying off the deficit. But that's one thing you have to remember about the deficit and the debt is that if you when you decrease the size of the deficit, the debt is still increasing because that's still the amount. All you're saying is that instead of say we're going to add, say the deficit, just to put it in micro numbers, if the national debt was $10 and then we ran a $2 deficit, and then you brought that deficit down to 50 cents, the national debt is still going to increase. It's the deficit that's decreasing. So, like Bill Clinton, for example, when he was president, worked with Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott, and they balanced the budget, and they got rid of the deficit, but not the debt. Calvin Coolidge, 1923 to 1929, was the last president to balance the budget every year in office, and the only president to be debt-free, to lead a debt-free nation, was all the way back to Andrew Jackson in 1837.
Well, I don't know if debt free is the goal, but I imagine there's a ratio that would be considered rational between, say, GDP and debt, and between GDP and deficit for that matter, right? One is P&L and one is more balance sheet ratio. Um, so, is there any way at this point possibly to get the debt and the deficit back into a rational relationship with GDP, or like how?
It's a great question. I think both parties want to spend money. Democrats want to spend money on social programs. Republicans want to spend money on tax cuts. Now, theoretically, the supply side theory of economics is that if you cut taxes, people will spend that money creating jobs, and then more money will get into the government kitties, and that will work to pay off the deficit and pay off the debt. So it's kind of like you can have everything. Um, at least that's the argument, and is that you can cut taxes and you can get rid of the deficit at the same time. But it's interesting, in order to really go after the national debt in traditional ways, and there's a group called the Concord Coalition that Paul Tsongas was actually associated with after he ran for president. And what they basically say is that in order to decrease the deficit, decrease the debt, you have to make the hard decisions, and that means potentially cutting programs and also potentially raising taxes. I mean, raising taxes, but I mean, part of it would be, I guess, cutting not even necessarily programs, but the growth of programs. Because even when you're cutting the growth of programs, there's going to be an argument why you should not do that. But there's a lot of certainly sacred cows in the national budget, and Republicans don't want to cut the defense budget. Democrats don't want to cut social programs. So how you're going to do it is obviously stuff that's very creative, but it's something where basically since I think Bill Clinton left, presidents have basically kind of kicked the can down the road. There have been times when the deficits decreased, but it's certainly not at a demonstrable rate.
Um, so did Doge do anything to reduce federal spending?
I don't think I don't know how much of that has actually been actuated so far. It was something obviously run by Elon Musk. But federal spending, in terms of a lot of what he talks about, is certainly cutting government, and that's not the large proportion of the budget. If you look at what the budget where it goes to entitlements, paying it goes to paying the interest in on the national debt, and
Okay.
it goes to the military budget. Government programs, it's something that it can make a small dent in the deficit and the deficit, but it's certainly not something that is going to make a huge hole there.
Are we going to see any changes regarding insider trading, do you think, by Congress?
Um, Congressman Burkett from Tennessee has proposed a law that would basically end insider trading for members of Congress. I think Nancy Pelosi has kind of become the poster woman in terms of the money that she made when she was in Congress. How much that was, whether that was insider trading or whether that was simply having a husband who was very good in investing, I don't know. But it's become, certainly it's not the it's a secondary tertiary issue for most people. Most people are worried more about affordability than they are about whether congressmen are making more money. But it's certainly something that there is a little bit of bipartisan support for. But I would think members who are engaged in insider trading would not be in their self-interest or self-preservation.
Probably not.
Rich, I'm keeping an eye on the time here, and you have to go be on TV in a couple of minutes. But before we let you go, what do you think Trump's going to talk about tonight?
I think he's going to take credit for the economy. He's going to talk about the golden age. He's going to say that the economy is proliferating, that it's getting better, that the economy has never been this good. He's going to talk about the tariff and how much revenue it's brought in. He's probably going to go after the Democrats like he does. He's probably going to blame Biden for a lot of things. He's going to blame Biden certainly for the inflation. I'm assuming this is traditional, story. This is traditional Donald Trump. He could go off on a completely different tangent and give a more bipartisan, non-ideological address, but that would be my prediction. What he's going to talk about. He's going to talk about the economy, and he's going to talk about how it's improving, and he's going to be talking about how Joe Biden was responsible for the inflation crisis. That's my supposition.
How many nobody ever has seen will there be in his speech?
43.
43. Okay.
Well, maybe not.
Awesome.
Maybe 3.
At least.
Well, Rich, thank you so much for joining us tonight. When I stop the recording, please don't hang up until you're 100% uploaded. It should be really quick. And we look forward to seeing you again.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
And
Okay.
thank you so
Best
much
of luck
again,
to you.
Rick. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.